Like, what?
Maybe where you're talking about, or I can just speak till I'm done speaking. Whoops, I opened something. Oh, clutch. Whoops. All right. To say that college tuition right now in the United States is a problem would be a drastic understatement. And this round we've been given with a resolution purporting a solution to the problem. The resolution is colleges should lower tuition rates. Before I jump into two rather substantial contentions, I want to lay some points of framework. The first point of framework is that we're addressing this resolution as a fact resolution. There are two reasons for this. One, there's no policy mechanisms, that eliminates the policy option. And second, there's no conflict of values or value supported just in general, and so that eliminates the value option. This is clearly a fact resolution, we'll be treating it as such. Second, I have one definition to provide with a couple reasons for it. That is the definition of colleges. We're limiting colleges for the purposes of this round to state colleges only. So we're debating whether state colleges should lower their tuition rates or not. And there are two reasons for this. One, state colleges are the highest tuition bracket across the board, so that's the most imminent need to lower tuition rates. And second, increasing tuition or decreasing tuition rates for private universities like the Ivy Leagues and other elite universities would ruin or take away their eliteness from the quality of their education. It's fine for them to have high tuitions because it's a barrier to students being accepted and so forth, whereas state colleges, as being public universities, sort of have a de facto responsibility to allow as many students as possible to at least apply and afford the education that they provide. So highest need bracket and the high cost barrier preserves the eliteness of private universities. The value for this round, since we're treating it as a fact resolution, is simply the preponderance of evidence. Whichever team shows you that college tuition rates should or should not be changed, higher or lower, deserves to win the round. It's pretty straightforward. Having said that, I want to launch into two contentions as to why tuition rates for state colleges should be lowered. The first is that of an educated population, basically the need for population to have access to, or reasonable access to education, because an educated population is much better than an uneducated population. The first point of this is that Americans are dumb. Now that's a sarcastic hyperbole, but across the board Americans are rather unintelligent just because of the lack of education. Exhibit A under this point is Donald Trump. Exhibit B is Bernie Sanders. Americans are uneducated across the board as far as their political knowledge, their economic knowledge, their social interactions, all sorts of things. There's a need for more education or higher education, access to higher education in the American population. The B point into this is that everyone should be able to go to college. Now, before I continue, I want to draw a stark distinction between the statement, as whatever her name is in the Bush administration said, that everyone should go to college, whereas everyone should be able to go to college. College is the key to a higher education is the key to an educated population. Everyone should have the ability to. The point that I want to make into this, though, is that price should not be the barrier to state colleges, to people being admitted to state colleges. What should be the barrier? Well, reasonable things like test scores or other admission standards, but simply the price tag for a good that you want to acquire, specifically something as crucial to society's education, should not be the barrier. And there's substantial support for this in pretty much any philosopher, whereas any ancient philosopher, education being the key to a healthy society. And so only allowing the rich to be educated rather than only allowing the best fit to be educated, those are two very different worlds. One is better. The price world is the not good one. Price is the wrong barrier, basically. I want to throw a couple statistics before I move on to some impacts under this contention. The first is that average college tuition has increased over 500% in the last 3 decades. The average price of college for state tuition, or of state college tuition, has increased 500% over the last 3 decades. What that looks like transferred post-graduation in student debt is the average student debt is $30,000 for a person just leaving college. Now that number may not strike you as that drastic because we hear horror stories of students graduating with $80,000, $100,000, $200,000 worth of debt. But compared to this statistic, where in 2004, cumulative student debt of all American graduates was $260 billion, and now, just over a decade later, the total student debt is $1.2 trillion. It's increased $1 trillion in cumulative student debt in just over a decade, and that's with admission and acceptance rates and graduation rates dropping. that's not a good situation at all. There's three impacts to this contention: to increasing the accessibility of education and removing the price barrier. The first is better citizens. An informed citizen, an educated citizen, is the key to any healthy society. An ignorant citizen is useless and even a negative harm to that society that he or she resides in. Second impact is competitiveness increase, and this is specifically in the area of job-wise, both domestically and internationally. The individual is more competitive in the domestic job market, and as a whole, American employees are more competitive in the international job market when we have a higher level of education. I don't need to recite all the statistics where the United States is not performing even the top 5 or 10 places of any number of education evaluations globally, like math, STEM, all sorts of things. American education is not, or American performance in education fields is not stellar right now. The third impact, though, is economic benefits. And that's specifically from reducing student debt and increasing usable income. Usable income is key to any economic growth. And when students are having to pay back something that they've experienced for the past 4 years, instead of having more usable income to purchase commodities, goods, and services and foster economic growth that way, there's a clear advantage between having more usable income and as opposed to simply paying off tens of thousands of dollars of student debt. Now, the second contention is rich colleges. Not only does the population and the individual benefit by being more educated and having more usable income and everything I just listed, basically, but colleges also benefit from having a bigger budget, a deeper pockets, basically. Now, this may seem on its face a little bit counterintuitive, but I want to start off this contention by saying that cutting programs and cutting things out of college budgets are not the key to increasing their usable income or making tuition lower for students. And I have two reasons why, the two subpoints. First is that higher prices equal lower admission. And we see this in part in the trend of decreasing admissions across the board, not only for graduate schools, but also for undergraduate schools in the United States right now. The key for colleges is to understand that lower prices equal more quantity. This is seen in multiple economic models across any economic sector, the entire economic spectrum, in low profit, high sales industries, or in comparing, and also comparing those low profit or low profit margin, high sales industries with their counterparts that have high profit margins and lower sales. For example, the difference between Ford and Rolls-Royce, where when they first started out, Henry Ford and Rolls-Royce, they both had completely opposite profit margins. One was high, one was low, and Henry Ford became a millionaire very rapidly, and Rolls-Royce, the original owner of Rolls-Royce, was very poor because he sold maybe 100 cars a year, even though his profit margins were very high. So that's the key. Lower prices equals more quantity. Low prices not equal low profit. The second point is that graduates with lower debt will be more readily able to donate back to their alma mater, which again is a second increased source of income for colleges. So not only do they have more students accepted, not at this time, I'm projected time.
Overtime.
No, I meant 7. Oh, is this not an 8-minute speech? Oh, shoot, I forgot. Oh well, I'm done.
Don't worry about it.
No, this is yours. That was a really good speech. I shouldn't have asked for the timer. I shouldn't have gone.
Everyone is ready? Let's get started. Well, the government team got up here and gave a really great speech. In fact, we as the opposing team agree with almost every part of it, other than the way that the round was framed and the comment about Bernie Sanders' intelligence. Let me get into this. Let's get into this. Let's start with the way they framed this round. They said that this round is a fact round, and they are treating it as a fact round. This should not be a fact round. This should be, and clearly is, a policy round for multiple reasons. Let's take a look. First, the word "should" in the resolution clearly implies that this is something that should happen. This is a policy that should be passed, should or should not be passed. For this reason, it's clear that the framers' intent was that this is going to be a policy round. That's how my partner and I prepped, and that is how the round was meant to be debated. The impact of this is that there's unequal ground. There's unequal ground because how in the world can my partner and I debate that college tuition should be higher? There's just no way, because in a perfect world, if the government team can mandate that it should be lower, we shouldn't have cancer. There should be no poverty in the world. There should be no hunger. Those are true things, but that leaves no ground for the opposing team to argue with because it's just true. So when we look at the framers' intent, it's clear that this should be a policy round, And the impact of that is that there is a lack of ground, unequal ground for each team in this round. So let's move on. Let's look at some more reasons why this should be structured as a policy round and why my partner and I will debate this as a policy round. Is that there are real world impacts to this discussion. The government team believes that there is simply a matter of should or should not, and yet if we treat this discussion as in that fashion, they're ignoring the real world solutions that we can be talking about. They're ignoring the real world solutions we've been called to talk about in today's debate round. If we don't have a policy that we're proposing, then we're not discussing solutions. We're just discussing something abstract with no real world impacts. Which gets me on to my next point, their internal inconsistency, that they actually had a number of impacts in their speech, implying that they're proposing some kind of policy when in fact they are not. They're not proposing any course of action. They're simply making an abstract utopian claim that college prices should be lower. So with that, with the round framed as a policy round, I believe I've clearly shown that it was meant to be this way. I'm going to continue through my speech and show why you should vote the government for the opposing team, because I'm going to provide not only agree that colleges should lower their, I'm going to actually provide a solution for the problem implicit in the resolution with a counter plan. So let's first look at Bernie Sanders' way of looking at the world. He proposes a plan that the federal government would increase funding for public institutions. I agree with their plan that we should look at state colleges, public institutions in today's round. So as such, let's look at how Bernie Sanders is looking at this problem. He looks at the problem and he sees that indeed there are extremely high tuition costs right now, and the answer to that, that will bring about all of the benefits that the government team proposed, is with government funding of these institutions. All we need to do is, as the federal government, propose to give states, every state that is willing to match the funds of the federal government, give the state money to lower the tuition of the students. We have some numbers on this. It would only cost an insignificant amount compared to the economic impacts of having better educated citizens that the government team themselves proposed. So we have a real solution here. We have a real policy that we think we can pass to help go towards solving this problem. So already the round is balanced in favor of the opposition team. So we look at the solution here. We see that indeed we will have a high quality of education. First of all, there will be no cuts. If you pass the government team's plan, not plan, the colleges are going to have to cut something. They never really got into this because they're essentially advocating a utopia where there are no costs for anything, but in real world, there are going to have to be cuts if you lower the price of tuition. That's just the way economics works. They got into some economics. We agree that we should use economics as a weighing mechanism, and when you cut the price of if you have no additional income, you cut the cost and have no additional income coming into these colleges, there's simply going to be no way the college can continue to operate without cutting something. The result of this, the impact of this, is a lower standard of education. Either they're going to have to cut professors' salaries, they're going to have to cut the amount of hours that tutors have to help students, they're going to have to cut the facilities that they're building to help best educate these students. There's going to be cuts, and the impact will be that there are less well-educated people. Of course, this impacts out to all the things that they impacted to, that we aren't going to be able to compete as a country in the global workforce. We are not going to be able to compete against countries with superior education systems if we pass their plan, which isn't, again, I'm not going to spend any more time on that, isn't really a plan. So we see the impact already, that if we pass their plan, there are going to be cuts. If you pass our plan, we're simply stimulating the whole system, and there's no downside. Lest the government team get up here and attack the cost of our plan, we would like to just remind them of their points, that a more educated workforce actually results in higher amounts of economic growth, results in higher tax take, and will over time outweigh the benefits of our plan will outweigh the cost. So again, if you agree with their own analysis of having a better educated workforce, you'll vote for the government team, you'll vote for our solution. So moving on, we can see that again, more people will go to college. This was one of their points. We're taking it for our plan because it's true. When we have a lower barrier to entry for college education, more people will go. We're going to see a higher level of education. I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this because they already articulated it for me. So when we look at the end of the day, Judge, we see clearly that this is a policy round. They're implicitly bringing up impacts, yet they have no solution, they have no policy. They're taking away ground from the opposition team by trying to debate this as a fact, and it's really a rather shallow attempt to try to fiat for utopia. So this clearly should be a policy, has the word should. We can talk about real world impacts, we can talk about solutions, not just abstract should or shouldn't, we can talk about solutions. We can have a real debate with even ground on either side if this is a policy. If you accept that this is a policy, you'll vote for the government team without any hesitation whatsoever. So if you pass our plan, we have a solution, and we have a number of good reasons to vote for us.
No, stop. Zack.
Okay, let's begin. I agree with my opponents that you should indeed vote for the government team. But education is a vital part of American society, and it's necessary that we allow and extend the ability to get education, to get higher education, to get a degree to more Americans than currently have access to it. And this is mainly due to the price barrier. Now I'm going to be first responding to his analysis, talking about whether it's a fact or policy resolution, and then be going over his counterplan, I'm assuming that's what it is, as well as his response to our case, or just a general disadvantage, I think it would be properly labeled. I have several reasons why this is not a policy round. It is in fact a fact round. The first reason is that of unspecified actor. Now when we look at the resolution, it says colleges. Now what colleges? Are we talking about private colleges, state colleges? Are we talking about colleges in California? Are we talking about colleges in Pennsylvania? There is no specified actor here. Because when we're talking about colleges, you can't just say we're talking about that we need to mandate all colleges take this action. You can't mandate all colleges because all colleges are different. Every single college has a different administrative policy. Every college has a different tuition rate. Every single college is different, and so there is no specified actor. This resolution is general. My second response is that policy debate is impossible. Policy debate is impossible. The reason for this stems from the first reason. If we have all of these differences, then we cannot actually have a policy debate because we can't actually pass a policy that applies to every single college. There is no policy that every college can pass. There is no administrative specificity, which makes the debate actually impossible because there's no specific framework that we can have as a plan in our first speech that the government or opposition team could therefore respond to. Do you have a question?
My question was, why can't you specify a plan for every college to follow?
What are we going to say? Mandate every single every single college mandate lower tuition. By how much are we going to lower tuition? By like a specific percentage? Well, that works for some colleges and not for other colleges. How are we going to fund it? Are we going to be cutting budgets in one area or another area? Every college has a different area that they can cut money from. How are we going to extend admission? Differs by every single college. We literally cannot make a policy that applies to every college. It's literally impossible, which is why the colleges aren't all in one system. All the colleges are part of different systems, which makes a policy debate about college tuition impossible, that we must have a fact resolution. My third response is that should allows for fact. Should allows for fact. His response as well, one of his arguments was basically, well, it says should in the resolution, so it's obviously a policy. This is simply not true. Should, in fact, it does many times point towards a policy resolution, but in fact allows for fact resolutions. Fact resolutions are basically saying that something will or should happen in general. And with the criterion for preponderance of evidence, we're simply arguing that this should in fact happen in the status quo, and that it's not happening, not necessarily advancing a policy that makes it happen with fiat power. My fourth response is that much more equal ground. Much more equal ground. One of his arguments was that, well, it makes the ground unequal. It makes them argue for something, or it makes it harder for the opposition to argue in this round. In fact, it doesn't make it harder, it makes it much more equal. Why? Because it takes away government abuse. The ability of the government team to have abuse of this resolution is great. If we define it as a policy resolution, we could say, well, this particular college in Podunk, Missouri, is going to lower their tuition because they spiked it last year due to unfair or unjust reasons. So there's a lot of room for abuse on the government side in this resolution, and we have removed all the ability for abuse by the government team, and we've made the ground much more equal. We can have a fair debate, an equal debate about whether tuition in general should be lowered. Should we have more access to education? My fifth response is that it fact impacts the real world. Fact impacts the real world. It impacts the real world just as much as a policy round, because policy rounds don't actually have any impact on the real world. They talk about impacts to the real world, but so do fact rounds. Fact rounds talk about what would happen if all tuition was lowered. If there was less tuition, we can actually talk about what the impacts on the real world would actually be, instead of getting caught up on the little details of, well, will the administration be able to pass a policy that lowers tuition? We actually talk about the policy itself and what impacts it has in the real world, what it will actually do in the real world, instead of getting caught up on specifics of a policy resolution. My sixth response is that it allows deeper analysis. It allows deeper analysis. It allows us to actually get to the heart of the issues, talking about what would actually happen if we lower tuition versus raising tuition, instead of talking about policy issues, as I mentioned earlier. This allows for deeper analysis of the specific issues. We can talk about the problems of student debt. We can talk about the problems of lacking an educated citizenry. These are things that can get lost in a policy round, and in fact are lost in a policy round every time we have policy rounds, which is why we have presented this as a fact round. As a fact round, we can get much more analysis, a much deeper debate on these specific issues. My seventh reason is that the resolution is general enough. The resolution is general enough. The wording of the resolution that colleges should lower their tuition is general enough to allow for a fact resolution, because it's talking about colleges in general and saying that they should lower their tuition in general, that they should all have a generally lower tuition. This clearly lends itself to a fact resolution, because by allowing this amount of generality, by not having a specific enough actions or specific enough actors, it means that we need to have a broad enough resolutional interpretation to have a broad enough debate about the issue. So if we don't have a general enough debate about the issue, then we're not actually getting at the heart of the resolution. The resolution in its generality requires a fact resolution, and if it was interpreted as a policy, it would be abuse of the resolution and not getting the spirit of the resolution and the heart of what it's actually wanting us to debate. Let's move on to his other argumentation. He presented what is essentially a cabinet plan that basically we're going to be following Bernie Sanders' plan that the government is going to match money by giving it to schools and thus lowering tuition. I have a couple of responses to this. My first response is that of failed burden. If my opponents believe this is a policy resolution, by presenting a counterplan and not labeling it as a counterplan, not having actors or specified funding or anything to specify a plan, they've actually failed their burden as an opposition team in presenting a counterplan. A counterplan can't just be like, we're going to be giving money to schools as the government. You need to actually have mandates, plans, actors, specified funding, timeline. There are a lot of things that a plan needs that they don't have in their actual plan. But secondly, and further, you can simply prune this plan. There's no reason why this couldn't be done in conjunction with, I guess, the non-plan of the government team. If you accept the resolution as a policy resolution, which I in fact think you should not, then you can simply do this at the same time as anything that the government does. But thirdly, it's not a policy resolution, so there's no reason to present this as a plan. And if we simply examine it as an alternative, as evidence, under the criteria of preponderance evidence, that colleges shouldn't unilaterally lower the tuition, that we should have government assistance, I think that we can safely see that this is not an exclusive argument. That providing government assistance isn't exclusive to colleges lowering their tuition themselves, and there's no reason why it should prevent them from doing so. His only offensive argumentation was that the colleges are going to have to cut programs because of loss of revenue. And I think that he actually didn't respond to any of our analysis under our preemptive analysis of this point. My partner pointed out the economic, or the second contention that colleges benefit. I believe some of it was over time, but some of it was on time, should be on the flow. And that is that higher prices lower prices increase admission. Basically, what colleges are going to be able to do is increase their total revenue stream because lower tuition will lead to increased admission rates and increased total revenue going to the school. So colleges don't have to cut programs. They don't have to cut a lot of the stuff that they offer to students, and thus we don't have any of the negative impacts that the opposition mentioned. Thank you.
thanks everybody for coming out today. Quick roadmap. I'm actually going to go kind of backwards. I'm going to go through his addressing of our counter plan, and then I'm going to go through his last critique there at the very end of the speech. Then I'm going to go and show exactly why we should be viewing this as a policy around and why that matters. Okay, the first thing, he critiqued our counter plan because it failed our burden, supposedly failed the burden, it didn't present a good mandate, and they can just sort of absorb this plan and whatnot. Why did we end up running sort of a nebulous counter plan that didn't really fit into either fact or policy? Because we weren't sure what we were debating, because the government team misinterpreted this resolution. Why were we forced to present a plan like this that doesn't actually clash with their argumentation? Because they didn't provide us with any plan that we should counter against. They didn't give us anything that we could actually say, okay, here's your hypothetical world, and here's the hypothetical world that we're proposing. That's why our counter plan sort of falls apart, because they didn't set the ground for a good debate. So if this debate feels like a train wreck, Judge, it's because the government team failed to interpret the round properly, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. And again, not enough offense against the last critique there at the end of the speech was that my partner didn't bring up enough offensive argumentation against the other team. Why is that the case? Because they didn't run policies, so we can't actually run disadvantages, because they're not acknowledging that this is a hypothetical world that we're talking about today. They're just saying, oh, we should have lower tuition. Everybody knows that that's true, but if you don't actually have a mandate and a policy that we can talk about, we can't run any disadvantages. You've taken all our ground from us. So we're going to get into these 7 replies to why supposedly this should be a background. Okay, the first response here was that there's an unspecified actor. Okay, so colleges. Colleges, first of all, is an actual actor. And the main thing you have to do as a government team is you have to narrow who the actor is. And you actually have to narrow it down. I'll get to you after this point. So when you have an unspecified actor, you have to narrow it, and you have to make it something specific that we can talk about for a policy. For example, you could have made it about state schools, which they actually did do. They showed that this round can be narrowed down to just state schools by narrowing that down in their fact paradigm, their flawed fact paradigm. They showed that it's totally possible to just consider one type of school without losing ground. That's exactly what they should have done with this resolution, with this quote-unquote unspecified actor. It's not an unspecified actor, it's a broad actor, and it's the government's job that they failed to meet to narrow it down into a real policy paradigm. I'll take your first of 2.
Yeah, where's this committee colleges, or this committee state colleges, that we can find as an actor to do something?
State colleges are funded through the government and controlled by the government, so you can just mandate the United States federal government to control these schools. Like, they control the funding for these state schools, so they can directly impact their tuition by providing more funding for state schools. So that's something that you could have done, like, and it didn't happen. I don't know why. So, and even in that case, so like you could have had the federal government provide more funding for state schools, or you could have individual states provide funding for state schools, like the state of Pennsylvania, or something like that. You could have mandated it like that, and it would have been totally fair, because it would have been taking a hypothetical and narrowing it down to something that we can actually debate fairly. Okay, so a second point here was that policy debate is supposedly impossible, because this isn't a policy that every school can enact. Again, you can narrow it down to like just talking about state schools in one specific state, or just talking about increasing federal funding or whatever. Like, state schools are controlled by the state. So when you're talking about what the college is doing, you're actually talking about what the state government is doing. And you're talking about the state of Pennsylvania, for example, increasing funding and thereby mandating lower tuition for their schools in that state.
Are you aware that state schools are actually not controlled by the states, but are in fact controlled by board of regents that are unrelated to the state government and simply accept funding?
But okay, sure. The point is, like, even if they're controlled by a board of regents, who controls the tuition? Who controls the money flow? What directly impacts the tuition more than anything else? Why are state schools already cheaper than our private schools? Because like they take money from the states. So if you mandate a state, which is what you should have done, if you mandate a state like Pennsylvania to give more money to state schools within their state, it doesn't matter if the Board of Regents controls day-to-day operations. You're effectively cutting tuition. You're fulfilling the mandate of this policy resolution. Okay, so third point here was that should allows for fact. I mean, there's really no argument here. Like, sure, fine. Should could be a fact round, but there's a prima facie like obligation to look at it first as a policy round. That's what we did. And then if you really have solid argumentation to prove why it's a fact round, you should have brought that up in the first speech, which wasn't really solidly addressed as to why exactly this is a fact round and why we shouldn't just take it on the face of it as a policy round, which it clearly is when it has the word should in it. So point 4 here was that fact allows for equal ground. Okay, so essentially the argumentation here was we could have abused you guys if we ran it as a policy round. Well, you could have also not abused us, so there's really not a lot there to talk about. So the argument here was like, oh, if we interpret this as a policy, then there's room for government to abuse, but that doesn't mean the government team has to abuse. You could have run it fairly, you could have run it with equal ground in any of the ways that I've been talking about here. And nobody would have lost ground, it would have been a fair thing here. Point 5 here was that fact impacts the real world. Okay, so basically what was said in this subpoint was really interesting, because It was basically saying, if we do this thing, hypothetically, then what would be the case in the real world? That's how it impacts the real world just as much as policy. Well, I've got news for you. Hypotheticals are policy. A fact round is something about, oh, Biden will win. Biden will win the primary if he ran. Or like, Hillary will win the Democratic primary and then she'll win the general election. That's a fact round as to talk about what will happen. But if we're talking about a hypothetical, which is seated in the last point, you should look at your flow, Judge, because the last speaker definitely said that we're talking about if we did this thing, like hypothetically, if colleges lowered their tuition, what would happen? And there's no way that we can really run disadvantages unless we're actually talking about a policy round, which is clearly what's happening here. So like the definition of policy is looking at a hypothetical world. If X, then what? That's what we're looking at. Then what? What are the impacts here? What exactly happens? What would happen if we did this thing? That's what a policy round is. That's why we should have interpreted it as policy. Point 6 here was, this allows us for deeper analysis. There's nothing wrong with policy analysis. I think the policy debate is one of the best things about parliamentary debate. I don't think there's deeper analysis happening here just debating about a resolution because the government team pulled a fast one on us and decided to interpret it as fact. Like, we would be having real analysis about a real policy that could happen in a hypothetical world if we had actually interpreted this resolution right in the first place, which we didn't do. Okay, point 7 here was that the resolution is general enough. So the real reason that the resolution is viewed as so general is because the government team failed to come to the table and actually narrow it down, which is their responsibility to do. That's why this resolution is supposedly so general. So really the thing here is, the thing that we need to look at is, does the opposition team have real grounds to argue in a fact paradigm here? So like, if this is actually a fact paradigm, obviously we know that like it would be great if colleges lower their tuition. But if we're not talking about a fact paradigm, we can't, if we're talking in a fact paradigm, the opposition team doesn't have any ability to run disadvantages. If we're talking about a hypothetical world, however, which is what we should be talking about, we could talk about, okay, if colleges took this policy, or if state schools or whatever took this policy and did this thing, then this stuff would happen. That's what hypothetical impacts are, and that's exactly what policy round and policy debates are about. So we basically have no ability to run disadvantages. We don't have the ability to run a solid counterplan because they misinterpreted the round so badly in the first place, and that's why we've lost all our ground in this debate, and that's why I've spent so much time going down 7 points about why this should be a policy round rather than actually talking about the real issues. So Judge, if this round feels like a train wreck, that's simply because the government team misinterpreted it so badly that it became a train wreck inevitably. So for those reasons, you should definitely vote for the opposition team.
Thank everyone for coming out today. This has been a great round. I certainly hope it hasn't seemed like a train wreck. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, government team, for coming out. Thank you for my partner for giving a great speech, and thank you, Judge, for your time. Now, I believe this round comes down essentially to one voting point. I have a second one that I'll get to if I have time, but the real voting issue here in today's round is, did or did not the government team meet their burden? Well, we look at the way that they have defined the resolution. We look at the analysis that my partner and I have brought to the table. I certainly hope that by this point in the round, it's clear that they have not. Now, let me reiterate and show a little bit further why it should be clear that they have not met their burden as the government team, that they did not come to this round prepared to have a good debate. They came to this round prepared to fiat a rather utopian result, taking away ground from the opposition team and attempting to steal the round for themselves. Let's take a look. So first of all, we see that the entire premise that the resolution could not be narrowed down is internally contradictory to their cutting the round down to state schools. They cut the round down to state schools. If they get up here and they start talking about why we can't define state schools, they did. They defined them in their first speech. So anything they say is going to be a contradiction. It's a double bind. There's no way out of this for them. They defined the round as state schools. We believe that the round can clearly be defined as state schools. If you don't believe that it's a double bind, do you really believe that there's no way that they could define this round as merely state schools? Do you truly believe that there's no way that they could find some way of defining what a state school is? There's clearly a way this can be done. That was their burden, and they did not meet it. So that covers my subpoints A and B, kind of their points 1 and 2. Let's moving on to subpoint C. They didn't clearly show in their first speech why this should be a fact round. We brought to the table a number of very good reasons why it should not be. We believe that should implies that there should be a solution. We believe that a solution should be what's being discussed, not some kind of hypothetical round where we cannot bring disadvantages to the table. So for that reason, you should throw out their third point. Next, they said that they could abuse the government, they as the government team could abuse us because they could go to any specific college. They could have tried, we would have addressed that, but we believe that it was their burden to define the round, and they did not try to define it to anything specific. And well, they did. They defined it as state schools, but that's a little bit besides the point. So moving on, we believe this could have been a better round and was intended to be a better round as a policy round because we could bring disadvantages to the table. We could truly talk about the impacts and be talking about solutions. We could be talking about both at once. The impact would have been a better educational value for both teams, a better learning experience for you, Judge, as you go out and live your life, thinking about how education should be run. And this simply was not the case. We were not able to discuss these things because they attempted to debate the round as a fact round. So this kind of encaptures my subpoint F here, is that policy provides a discussion about solutions that they simply don't bring to the table. So when we look at the end of the day, we see that they were unable to narrow down the round because they chose not to. They clearly could have. They did with state schools. We agreed to their definition of how this round should be narrowed down when we said that we were basing our counterplan off of the state schools. So we see that they clearly did not uphold their burden. My second voting issue real fast here is that a plan with answers is better than no plan at all. If you vote for the op team, you will be passing a plan that at least attempts to make a good case for the future, that at least attempts to solve these problems. If you vote Gov, you do not pass any such plan.
You wanted my timer. Oh, no, I was got my hands all over it.
Do you want a timer? I usually use this to count up.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. Sweet. All right. This has been an interesting round, and unfortunately, a lot of the argumentation is formed around the framework of the resolution rather than the actual meat and possible argumentation under the topic of the resolution. I think this round boils down to three issues, though: the framework, the education, and the money. Before I get to that, though, I want to have one preliminary comment, and that is low tuition is not a universally accepted truth, as Micah asserted in his last speech, the second to last speech, or the second to last opposition speech. And the resolution certainly does not assert it as such either. There's a generic actor in the resolution, there's a generic demographic presented in the resolution, and it's simply not a self-evident truth, evidenced by the fact that tuition is not low whatsoever and is simply increasing right now. So obviously, someone thinks it's a good idea for it to continue to increase. It's not simply this universal law that college tuition should be automatically low. That's why we're debating about it now. That's why it's a hypothetical fact rather than a status quo fact, which I'm going to be now addressing on the first voting issue of framework. So 3 voting issues again: framework, education, and money. Under framework, there's unfortunately a lot to address on this. First, we aren't fiating anything. As Colin keeps asserting, they're fiating a utopia. The utopia if you want to refer to it as a utopia, it's a very achievable utopia, it's a good utopia, but we're not fiating it. We're simply saying this would be a good thing. That's the difference, next point, between a hypothetical fact and a status quo fact. So, and evidence of this, they're saying there's no such thing as a hypothetical fact, it's a patent falsehood. This is evidenced by the fact of if we were debating science should clone human beings. That's obviously not a status quo fact, but it's a hypothetical fact that we're debating, considering, and discussing whether or not it would be a good idea for it to be a fact. That's the difference, that's the type of fact resolution that we're acting under right now. The second point is that it's simply not a fact resolution, and there are 4 distinct reasons for this. First, almost categorically, all of the analysis we presented since my very first speech as to why this is a fact resolution has not been addressed. Second reason, it's not a policy framework. 2 of the most pertinent reasons why is there's no actor, and it's too much of a general framework. They're accurate in saying that a general framework could be narrowed down, but this is simply far too general because it's not simply saying X government should and using some part of the government, but it says colleges. Every single type, style, and variation of colleges is included in this resolution. That's far too generic, and there's no universal acting body. Second is it's clearly not a value. There's no value conflict presented. And should is not exclusive to policy resolutions. This has been mentioned all throughout the resolution, principally by my partner. Should is not exclusive to policy frameworks. It does allow facts, reference my hypothetical versus status quo fact analysis. And finally, the last point of this is that the interpretation of the government team, of their actor, of how we should use colleges, brutally murders the resolution because as I said, there are so many different possibilities with that. So the framework debate obviously flows, not automatically, but obviously flows to the government team for if only the unaddressed framework or analysis of why this is a fact resolution. Now, under education, which was our first contention, there are 2 points I'm going to leave you with. First, education is the most important, or one of the most important aspects for a healthy society. And right now, high tuition rates are preventing everyone who could be educated from being educated, or who should at least have one reasonable way of accessing that education. That was never really responded to. We're saying that the barrier should not be funding, but it should be things like test scores or other admissions standards. Simply saying you can't afford it because the price tag is too high, so you can't be educated is brutally arbitrary and unfair and detrimental to a society. Also, second point under education, the impacts of education, which I mentioned, there were 3: better citizens, increased competitiveness, and a healthier economy, were completely unaddressed, and those are still fully accessed by the government team at the end of the round. The third and final voting issue is that of money. Now, this is crucial. Their idea that because a college accepts some money from a state government means the government runs that college is completely patently false. State colleges are state colleges because a small part of their budget, or a part of their budget, some smaller, bigger than others, is from the government, the state government. The reason why this college, Grove City College, is not a state college is because we don't accept federal or state funding. It's not because the state doesn't run our college, it's because we don't accept some funding from them. That analysis is false from the get-go. Second, government paying for everything would be viable. We're not saying that their Bernie Sanders type plan is wrong. We're simply saying, let's do something better and let colleges rake in the dough by lowering tuition rates, and let everyone who can conceivably get an education by low tuition rates, and allow more money to be flooded into the economy because the graduates have more usable income. Basically, everyone, all 3 of those parties benefit under a government hypothetical world, rather than the fact world of where Bernie Sanders' policy is implemented. That's the main difference at the end of the round, and that's why the government team deserves to win, because we're not saying their idea or this hypothetical world that they're advocating is wrong. We're simply saying let colleges rake in the dough by having low tuition rates, and which would lead to a higher volume of admissions, and let more people access college degrees, and let that more usable income be flooded into the economy. So for all those reasons, framework, education, and clearly all of the money, the government team deserves to win this round. Thank you. That was over time too.
So that's only a little bit.
5 seconds.
Yeah. I thought that was a good round.
Yeah, that was a lot better than I was expecting. I did not like this resolution.
I don't think either of you really understand what a state school is. I know I'm wrong, and I'm pretty sure you're wrong also.
No, I'm
Yeah,
really
like,
wrong.
Yeah, just
Because like the state school system is established by the state governments. They by act set up a regent board, or like a school administrative system. But then after that point, all of schools policy is determined by that administration outside of the government control. The government just provides funding, and all of the policies are determined by that